You think you know Henry VIII's bedroom, the velvet canopies, the gilt, the portraits glaring down like stern ancestors. But step across that threshold and the air changes. It's not a sanctuary. It's a courtroom. The sheets are affidavits. The bodies are exhibits. In Tudor England, the royal bed was a stage set for statecraft, and the first performance began on the wedding night. The rule was simple and savage. A marriage did not merely happen. It had to be proved. Not by vows or music or a bishop's blessing, but by flesh. In courts and chancelleries across Europe, consummation was more than a private moment. It sealed a union that law and church would otherwise pry apart. Canon lawyers, in tones as dry as parchment, defined it with chilling precision. The act that made a marriage indissoluble, the hinge on which dynasties swung and treaties held, or snapped. For most couples, proof was symbol, ritual, gossip that died at dawn. For kings, it could be spectacle. Across late medieval and early modern Europe, there were bedding customs that pressed clan and court into the bedchamber's doorway. The priest blessing the bed, attendants laying the couple, curtains drawn, the chamber left, but the point made. In some places, tokens of proof, the mourning's stained linens, were paraded as crude reassurance that the match had taken root. Whether the act itself was witnessed or only nudged toward, the message was the same. This union belongs to the realm as much as to the two who lie within it. Now put a crown on the groom and a kingdom on the line, and the air grows razor thin. For Henry VIII, a marriage bed could lift a woman to a throne or deliver her to the scaffold. Queens knew it. Courtiers knew it. Servants knew it because they were there, always there, at the doors, in the antechambers, in the narrow spaces where ceremony bled into surveillance. Tudor palaces were built for spectacle, not solitude. Even private rooms pulsed with attendants. The gentlemen of the privy chamber washed and dressed the king, tended him on the closed stool, and guarded the thresholds of his most intimate spaces. Proximity was power, and power meant watching. Privacy, in a royal palace, was a luxury rationed by rank and favor. So picture the first night for a young queen. Silks unlaced with hands that are not her husband's, candles guttering while the press of footsteps withdraws, and just beyond the curtains a kingdom leaning in, waiting for the morning's verdict. A single absence, a stain not found, a whisper passed with the wrong name in it, could swell into a legal storm. Everyone at court understood the calculus. No proof meant no foundation. No foundation meant annulment. Not divorce, annulment, the declaration that a marriage had never truly existed at all. Ask Anne of Cleves, whose alliance evaporated in a tangle of non-consummation and insult, neatly tied off by a council hungry to keep the king virile on paper and blameless in policy. The morning after, the queen awoke under the weight of more than brocade. Physicians could be summoned, not for comfort, but for confirmation. Their findings, hushed in chambers, shouted in corridors, might travel faster than any letter, clinging to the queen like a second skin. In a world where royal bodies were public texts, any ambiguity became accusation. If the evidence faltered, the realm reached for explanations that cut. Witchcraft, deception, treason. In this theater, even silence looked suspicious. Catherine of Aragon learned early how betting and politics could be braided to a noose. Her first wedding, not to Henry but to Arthur, the boy king who died before his beard, would shadow her forever. Years later, when Henry sought to pry himself free, whether Catherine had consummated that earlier marriage became the pivot of Europe's most watched legal case. She swore she had not. He claimed sin and impediment. The question passed from confessional whispers to councils and courts, from memory to doctrine. It was not two teenagers' wedding night anymore. It was the hinge of a dynasty. And the queen's body was not simply a body. It was a ledger to be audited. Servants listened for laughter or quarrels, for the rustling cadence that meant the realm might expect an heir. Gossip hardened into testimony. Testimony calcified into policy. The bed linen could become a document. The queen's pallor, a rumor. The king's satisfaction, a communique. This was the perilous metamorphosis of intimacy into evidence, and no one could pretend it was private. A bed that should have been a place of rest became a courtroom where verdicts were whispered before they were written. The cruelty hid in plain ritual. Bedding customs, coy, ribald, communal, had long served as public assurances that the new household belonged to its people. In royal houses, they became instruments of scrutiny sharpened to a fatal edge. When the curtains closed, they did not close on the kingdom's curiosity. The expectation remained, humming through joists and tapestries. Produce proof, produce heirs. Fail at either, and the machinery groaned to life. Confessors consulted, physicians called, counselors convened. To live under that gaze was to breathe shallow. Imagine Catherine, who had lost children and faced the slow ice of her husband's withdrawal, kneeling at prayer because there was nowhere else to set her fear down. Imagine a young bride like Anne Boleyn, clever, calibrated, stepping into a bed where every private sound had public consequence, knowing that her very first night would be tallied against the realm's hunger for a son. The courtiers' faces, the ladies' hands, the priest's blessing. Each gesture was a line in a ledger that would be read back to them if fortune turned. Sometimes the proof did not take. Henry's marriage to and of Cleves unraveled in weeks, punctured by his ridicule and a formal finding that the union had not been consummated. The legal fiction was neat. No consummation, no marriage. But that tidiness cost the queen her crown and recast her future with a new title, the king's sister. A mercy born of politics, not pity. The logic, once established, would tempt the king again and again, offering a trapdoor under any bed that failed to give him what he wanted most. You can hear the menace in the fixed smile of ceremony itself. The priest's blessing of the bed, a ritual meant to sanctify tenderness, becomes a seal for witnesses who will never see the two who lie within it as mere husband and wife. The curtains close, and yet the court remains, measuring, imagining, inventing. In palaces where privacy was an architectural afterthought, the queen could not put a wall between herself and the world. The privy chamber, that inner ring of rooms and men, existed to attend the king's person, his body, his appetites, his sleep. What began as service thickened into surveillance, a politics of proximity in which those nearest were both necessary and dangerous. So if this first rule sounds like a horror story, prove it, or else. That is because it was. It turned breath into evidence and sleep into testimony. It meant a queen entered marriage alongside her fear and her nation. It meant that Henry's bed, grand as a painted ship, sailed with the hold packed tight. Canon law, court rumor, dynastic anxiety, the microscopic scrutiny of people whose livelihoods depended on predicting the wind of the king's pleasure. The whole apparatus flexed on the wedding night and never truly relaxed. And this is merely the doorway. Because once a marriage had been proved, a queen discovered that proof bound her to a cycle with no mercy in it. Fail to please, and the failure was treasonous. Fail to conceive, and the failure was political. Dare to resist, and resistance could be rewritten as sedition. But that is the next chapter. For now, remember the hush after the chamberlains withdraw, the candle shadow trembling on the tester, and the realization that the kingdom is lying awake just outside the curtains, waiting to judge what only two should ever know. The second rule was not written on parchment, but everyone in Henry's orbit learned it by heart. A queen does not refuse. Not the summons delivered at midnight when the palace was breathing in its sleep, not the request folded into a jest at supper, not the wordless tug of a curtain in a room where too many eyes had just departed. Consent, for a consort, was ceremonial, assumed rather than offered. When the king beckoned, the corridors remembered how quickly a no could be remodeled into treason. In the early, bright years, when the tilt yard was Henry's second chapel and he moved like a lark in armor, the command might have felt like flattery, called, chosen, crowned by attention. But time remakes bodies, and power is greedy. After the crash at the joust and the slow siege of illness, the king's body became a country beset, the swollen leg bound in poultices, the breath that carried the sour news of rot, the weight that demanded engineering rather than embrace. Yet the summons continued, as predictable as bells, and a queen's duty did not soften at the threshold of pain. If she hesitated, someone noticed. If she looked away, someone reported it. If she flinched, the story would find a listener eager to polish it into evidence. That is the trap at the heart of Henry's third rule. In this palace, bodies are evidence. Not just the queen's body, the king's as well, but only one of them was permitted to be blameless. When desire faltered or conception failed, the blame did not settle where age, accident, and agony suggested it should. Instead, it wandered the passages seeking a woman to incriminate. A wife who did not conceive must not be trying hard enough. A wife who conceived but did not bear a son must be cursed by nature or conspirators. A wife whose husband faltered in the bed must be accused of dampening him with witchcraft, of chilling him with cold arts or unnatural indifference. A private sorrow, that two people could not make another life together, was repurposed into public charge. Imagine the theater of it. A physician, trained in a world where humors argued in the blood and stars pretended to dictate the fortune of wombs, stands with a face lacquered into neutrality and asks questions no human should need to answer in front of witnesses. Servants are consulted, linens considered, calendars compared against the moon as though the moon kept court. The king's closest men, who dress him and place his napkin and fetch his gear, become interpreters of his silence. If he emerges somber, is it fatigue? If he emerges laughing, is it proof? The language of the body supplies too many nouns for a hungry court, and of Cleves felt that hunger. Their marriage, hurried by policy and cooled by meeting, never warmed. The king mocked her in private, and the council taught his sentiment to sing in law. Non-consummation, a clean phrase, a handy key. But notice who pays. She is removed from her throne and blessed with a new courtesy that turns her from wife into sister, a sleight of hand that keeps the king's dignity intact and his hopes for a son untainted by failure. The body is evidence, tidied, docketed, decided. And all the while the queen's person is treated as if it were a ledger where the realm's deficit can be made to vanish if only the math is rewritten at dawn. Catherine Howard walked into a sutler's snare, bright and young, her laughter easy, her past not erased. What a court cannot forgive in a queen is a past that does not submit to being retold. In the arithmetic of blame, any sign of appetite before a crown becomes proof of corruption after it. Any rumor becomes a confession if repeated with sufficient confidence. When the king's interest flagged or was diverted by pain, the deficit was measured against her. Too merry, too warm, too knowing, too less than a miracle. If he was cold, she must have chilled him. If he burned, she must have lit the match with forbidden sparks gathered elsewhere. The doctor with his humors steps aside. The accountant of scandal takes his seat. Surveillance completes the equation. The fourth rule, guards at the door, was born of the palace's design and the court's appetite. At Whitehall or Hampton Court, the road to the royal bed ran through antechambers staffed by men who built their fortunes on attention. They were not there merely to repel daggers. They policed access, timed visits, noted who waited and who was waved in, which lady lingered, which petition arrived wrapped in a smile. The threshold itself became a witness. To stand outside the king's bedchamber, hearing the murmurs slip through wood and weave, was to stand at the edge of power and learn how to read its weather. If that sounds like exaggeration, recall that proximity was the Tudor coin. The gentlemen of the privy chamber rose because they could be trusted with the king's person, and they flourished because they fed the court's hungers, news, hints, advantage. They carried in the cup and carried out the whisper. While a queen lived, every minute of her night could be summoned back into the day and made to stand trial 100 times over. A jest retold might change its meaning. A sigh, reported, might be revised into contempt. A delay, as brief as the time it takes to pin a sleeve, could be stacked with others to suggest a pattern dark enough to justify inquiry, then accusation. The queen knew the door was listening. She knew the chambermaids had been asked how she slept and whether she looked refreshed at breakfast. She knew the physician would draw polite maps of her pulse and color and urge practices that felt more like penance than care. The knowledge snaked into bed with her and lay between husband and wife. To summon desire in a room that remembered every failure is a species of courage most histories do not praise. To look at a man who is suffering in his body and still reach for him as a partner rather than as a sovereign to be appeased, that is its own kind of statecraft. But the court did not reward such delicate work. It tabulated outcomes, sons born, smiles displayed, hurdles cleared. Even the king was not free. He too lay beneath the gaze he had fostered. A monarch who forged a world in which intimacy became evidence eventually found his own flesh entering the archive. The leg that throbbed and leaked was described in letters. The apothecary's lists of salves read like dispatches from a war fought in meat and linen. The nights when pain soured his temper left footprints in the palace. A cup flung, a door shut too hard, a gentleman dismissed with a word he would spend weeks trying to repair. The next morning, the realm woke to his face at council and drew forecasts from the weather of it. The body at the center could not escape being a document. Still, it was the queen who paid the surcharge. Because when the royal machine looks for fault, it is trained by centuries of habit to find it in the woman. Call it doctrine, or jealousy of power, or a superstition that seems to outlive every law. If a king falters, blame his wife. If a king rages, blame the witch. If a king ages, blame the woman who could not chase the sun back up the sky. And once the accusation escapes its cage, the palace itself becomes a proving ground. A ring given too freely, a glance interpreted unkindly, a cousin with an old story to sell. These become forensic artifacts in a case where the verdict was written the moment the king's favor cooled. So the queen learned a repertoire of impossibilities. She must not appear reluctant, lest coldness be confused with conspiracy. She must not appear eager, lest eagerness be litigated into lechery. She must not seem afraid of his wounds, lest compassion be read as contempt. Nor must she seem too skilled at making him forget them, lest skill be read as sorcery. The safest course, impossible and therefore demanded, was to be exactly as the court wished her to be on any particular afternoon and precisely as the king needed her to be on any particular night, without being seen to try. This is how a marriage becomes a maze. At the entrance stands Rule 2, do not refuse. In the center coils Rule 3, your bodies will testify against you. And at every turn is Rule 4, the door is listening. Some queens ran by instinct until they were winded. Others learned to count their steps and measure their smiles like a careful dancer who knows a single misstep can be called a plot. A few, like Catherine Parr, developed a scholar's tact, soothing the king's mind with learned talk while skirting the subjects that sparked. Even she, cautious and quick, would feel the floor tilt when pamphlets and principles flared into danger. The house is not neutral. The house wants a story and will choose its villains. By now the pattern is visible even in candlelight. Coercion washed clean as duty. Surveillance perfumed as ceremony. Accusation dressed as doctrine. There is a clock in a queen's body, and in Henry's England it did not keep her time. It kept the kingdom's. From the first dawn after the wedding, her breath was counted in cycles, her appetite read for omens, her sleep interrogated for prophecies. Rule 5 made it plain. Pregnancy wasn't joy, it was duty. Not a hope whispered between two people, but a schedule enforced by an empire of watchers who had learned to map a woman's life by the lunar calendar and the king's appetite. The queen's chambers changed when this rule took hold. The soft seats by the fire became desks for ledgers. The quiet corners where a girl might once have read became staging grounds for consultations. Physique jars arrived, labeled in a careful hand. Pennyroyal excluded, saffron weighed, hartshorn shaved fine, comfits of anise, almond milk to soothe. The apothecary bowed and described the theory of humors as if listing the commandments. Too much heat in the blood makes a womb inhospitable. Too much cold makes it barren. The wrong foods thicken melancholy. The wrong scents disturb the brain's spirits and rattle the womb's resolve. He was earnest, and the ladies who served were tender, but the effect was a slow invasion. The queen's skin ceased to belong to her. It became an instrument upon which the court played the same song, louder and louder, until hope itself felt like noise. Her body marked the milestones, and everyone else kept the score. When her courses failed to come, the palace held its breath. The king smiled more. Musicians were called, then dismissed for being too merry. When a bleeding arrived late, it arrived like a verdict. The queen pressed a cloth between her teeth so no one could hear her cry. Should nausea seize her at supper, she became a text for a dozen readers. The physicians who proposed regimes, the ladies who whispered prayers, the counselors who adjusted wagers in their heads, and the king, who tried to be gentle until he remembered that gentleness could not change the outcome. A single meal might be orchestrated like a ritual. Pomegranate for fertility, ale cut with water to temper the heat, a capon stuffed with restorative herbs, and every swallow was a petition. Catherine of Aragon knew the rites by heart. She bore daughters and tiny sons who flickered like sparks in winter air, bright and brief. One infant prince warmed only the space of a month. Others came and were mourned in silence because grief had to be small enough to pack away when the ambassadors called. Yet Catherine's courage was the kind that makes a world bearable. She prayed for the health of those who loved her. She governed with a steady hand when the king crossed to France. She welcomed the birth of Mary with undiminished faith. But the arithmetic of succession had only one sum that counted, and Catherine could not bring it to hand. Each miscarriage wrote another line of argument into the king's conscience, and the theologians' pens began to scratch. And Boleyn entered the maze believing she could choose the doors, and for a time she did. Clever as a bright blade, she turned refusal into magnetism. Keeping the king at a distance he mistook for destiny. When she finally consented, the kingdom restructured itself around her promise, as if she were a palace being built in a single night. She brought a new grammar to the court, French-inflected wit, a taste for reformist texts, a quickness of mind that both charmed and threatened. In those first months the air seemed to gleam. The king stood taller, the music tilted toward laughter, even the courtiers' envy sparkled. Elizabeth arrived with a cry that sounded to her mother like a trumpet of triumph, and kissed the soft skull and whispered a queen's blessing, and for a span of days the world made room for a different dream, a daughter who could be destiny, a prophecy revised. But the old law of the clock reasserted itself. The hungry hope for a son gnawed the edges of every smile. Another pregnancy vanishing in blood, another, and the king's patience, always a thin coat over a furnace, blistered. The court had learned long ago how to translate a royal sigh. What had been poetry became policy. And once policy turned, every kindness a woman had received became an invoice she could not pay. The queen's daily life narrowed. She learned to walk as if the floor remembered every footfall and would report them. To rise too early was to seem restless. To sleep too late was to seem lax. To laugh too easily suggested she had forgotten her duty. To go stone-quiet fed rumors of coldness or despair. The physician, with his fretful kindness, suggested lascivious things gently. Lie thus, at such an hour, within these weeks, after this broth and before this cordial. The midwife murmured spells folded into prayers. Ladies sprinkled prayers into jokes, and then rescued them before they could sting. When the moon swelled, the queen swelled. When it waned, she tried not to. She carried herself like a vessel painted with the realm's coat of arms. Every success or failure, words far too blunt for the work two people do in the dark, was fenced in by an audience. The audience did not watch directly, but it listened with all the strength of its emptiness. The nursery adjacent to her chamber was readied and unreadied, the tiny garments folded and unfolded, a cradle tested for creak, and then pushed back against the wall as if it were a censure. The queen pretended not to notice, or noticed and smiled to show she had nothing to hide, or wept behind a chair with her head bowed and her lady's hands resting like birds on her shoulders. Whatever she did, the gesture was recorded. And then there was the grimmer article of Rule 6. Falling out of favor turned the bed into a scaffold built slowly, plank by plank, across the weeks when the king's eyes slid away and his laughter creaked. The same hand that had lifted a woman into the sun could tip her toward the shadow without warning. And felt that weather change first in dainty tempests, coldness at a mask, a conversation cut to the quick, a cousin promoted above a friend, and then in the kind of silence that even a palace cannot fill. In that silence, other voices grew bolder. Enemies she had frightened with her rise found their spines. Old debts were called in. Older stories were dusted off and fitted with new, wicked endings. Once the king looked past her, the court saw what it wished to see. A woman too witch bright to be safe. A wife who had promised sons and delivered a daughter whose brilliance could not save her mother. When the charges walked in, wearing the faces of men who had once grinned at her in music rooms, the queen understood how thoroughly intimacy had been weaponized. A smile across a lute became conspiracy. A conversation in a gallery became seduction. A brother's embrace became incest because the truth would not satisfy men who needed a more dazzling lie. The bed in which she had tried to summon a prince turned spectral, a place where the shadows rehearsed speeches for a trial already scripted by fear and hunger. It was not only a legal process. It was a purification ritual enacted by a court that wanted to wash its hands in the queen's blood and call itself renewed. Catherine Howard's turn came like a bright dance that steps abruptly into a trapdoor. Youth made her a lantern. The king warmed himself at it, and believed for a season that the fire burning in his leg and heart could be charmed into submission by the laugh of a girl. But youth comes with history, and courtiers collect histories like daggers. When whispers swelled, names from before her crown, kisses from before her destiny, the machine clicked into the next gear. Private warmth was repurposed into public rot. The web tied around her tightened until even her breath tangled in it. She knelt, trembling, not because she had schemed, but because she had trusted that the world would forgive a girl for being a girl before it demanded she be a queen. Between these ruins stands Catherine Parr, a different kind of survivor. She studied as if books could be armor, and sometimes they were. She prayed as if prayer were a lever that could shift the angle of the king's mind. She learned to soothe him without appearing to instruct, to retreat from theological precipices with the agility of a courtier who reads the wind. Even she felt the cold blade of suspicion graze her neck. Even she learned how quickly tenderness could turn to interrogation if the wrong pamphlet surfaced in the wrong sleeve. To be spared was not to be safe. It was to sleep in a room with the trapdoor left ajar. Duty hardened everything it touched. Love, which might have set its own table and eaten when it liked, was forced to serve on the king's schedule and send away hungry when it could not produce sons. Piety, which might have comforted, was pressed into argument. Medicine, which might have healed, was tasked with prediction and then punished for being imprecise. Even the queen's friendships were freighted until they bent. A smile to a lady wrist implying conspiracies among women. A kindness to a gentleman wrist suggesting the rest of the story that enemies were eager to supply. And yet, in the small minutes when the palace blinked, when a rainstorm kept ambassadors indoors, when the king fell into a heavy sleep and the watchman's footfalls steadied into a rhythm, the queen could feel the outline of another life. A hand on her belly that felt only like hope, not obligation. A whispered story from her childhood that made her laugh with one of her ladies as if they were girls conspire about nothing more dangerous than ribbons. A silent prayer that did not ask for a son, only for mercy. These, too, were real, though the record books do not show them. The chronicles prefer arrivals and departures. They log the days when the realm turned. They are silent about the mornings when a queen held herself still until her heart slowed, because stillness was the only defense she had left. By the time Rule 6 has done its work, the bedroom is no longer a place at all. It is an instrument. It measures loyalty, tallies heirs, manufactures guilt. It makes what cannot be guaranteed, life itself, into a requirement and then punishes the body that fails to conjure it on command. To enter it is to agree that love will be interpreted by accountants, that grief will be handled by lawyers, that sleep will, at dawn, be cross-examined. The queens walked in because the road to the throne runs through that room. They learned, too often too late, that the road can reverse itself and run from the chamber to the tower with shocking speed. The kingdom's greatest need, continuity, was yoked to the queen's most fragile hope, motherhood, and the harness cut. It cut even when velvet lay soft on the skin, even when music sweetened the air. The palace was never quieter than the morning after hope failed, never louder than the hour a midwife lifted a swaddled prince. And in both moments, the queen's face was studied as if it were a map for the next campaign. She learned to keep it serene, a mask that would not later be used against her. But the eyes behind the mask remained those of a woman who understood that time had been stolen from her, the ordinary time in which the body might be allowed to be ordinary. Rule 5 and Rule 6 grind against each other like millstones. Between them, queens vanish into flour that feeds the realm and leaves no recognizable shape behind. The court calls it destiny. The chronicles call it policy. The chaplains call it providence. The queens would have called it by a plainer name, if anyone had asked. They were not asked. They were summoned. There remains one chamber we have not fully entered, the last, dim one, where the king's own body, decaying in real time, makes a hell of intimacy and turns rumor into verdicts. The bed stinks of medicines and wounds. The door creaks with spies. The whisper of the court becomes a chorus hungry enough to devour anyone left standing. That is where the story goes next, into the final rule of rot and fear, where the sheets themselves remember what was done upon them, and the air carries the scent of endings. By Henry's final decade, the royal bedchamber reeked of mortality. Rule 7 was written in the air itself, the stench of disease. The same man who once embodied knightly vigor was now a ruin of flesh, carried into his bedchamber like a relic whose sanctity no longer came from beauty or strength, but from terror. His courtiers still addressed him with flourished bows, still whispered about his magnificence, but they did it through handkerchiefs pressed to their noses. The king's body was no secret. It could not be hidden. The leg ulcers that suppurated until linen yellowed, the sores that burst under the strain of movement, the rolling mass of his body that required hoists and contraptions to maneuver into place. He was not just heavy, he was colossal, swollen with disease until bed itself became a battlefield. He was 400 pounds of pain and rotting flesh, and yet his queens were expected to submit as though he were still the bright youth who had ridden through tournaments with a plume snapping in the wind. Catherine Parr, pragmatic and intelligent, endured his company with a perfumed cloth pressed discreetly to her face. Others could not disguise their dread, though they tried, because dread itself was perilous if seen. A gag, a wince, averted eyes. Any of these could be repurposed by enemies into whispers of disloyalty. The intimacy of those nights was an ordeal of endurance. No candle or tapestry could soften the grotesquerie. Henry's body bled, stank, collapsed in spasms of agony. It was not simply unpleasant. It was an assault, and it demanded that queens endure it with grace. They were commanded to honor the dignity of a man whose very breath carried the scent of decay, to pretend desire where only horror lingered. It is difficult, across centuries, to imagine that kind of performance, yet their survival depended on it. But if disease threatened queens with nausea, rumor threatened them with death. Rule 8 was the cruelest of all. Even whispers could kill. In Henry's court, gossip metastasized into evidence. The bedroom was never just a bedroom. It was a crime scene waiting for accusation. A servant who lingered too long, a lady-in-waiting who sighed in the wrong place, a smile exchanged with a musician. These could be forged into treason. And once the king's suspicion lit upon a woman, no force on earth could quench it. And Bullen learned this with brutal clarity. Her downfall was paved not by actions, but by talk. Rumors spun by courtiers who saw opportunity in destruction. They dragged her brother into it, forced confessions from tortured men, and whispered incest where there was only loyalty. The charges were fantasy, but fantasy was enough. Henry did not need proof. He needed release from a queen who had failed him in the one measure he valued, a living son. And so her laughter became lechery. Her wit became witchcraft. Her every gesture a mark of guilt. Her head rolled not because of what she did, but because of what the palace said she did. Catherine Howard's ruin was cut from the same cloth. Her girlhood flirtations, years before her marriage, were resurrected and weaponized. Men were tortured into confessing what was demanded of them. Her youth, once her crown's advantage, now condemned her as reckless, impure, unfit. The palace's gossip net was vast. Maids who cleaned her chambers, ladies who brushed her hair, guards who stood near her doors. All were informants when fear demanded it. And once enough of them murmured, the rope tightened. Catherine, still a teenager, was dragged from laughter into a scaffold silence. In Henry's palace, even silence itself was suspicious. A queen too quiet at table was brooding. A queen too lively was conspiring. If she leaned close to a cousin, the gesture could be treason. If she walked alone too often, she was plotting. The network of eyes and ears was everywhere, ladies in waiting primed to betray their mistress, courtiers trading rumor like currency, servants rewarded for slander. There was no refuge, no conversation sacred. Even in the intimacy of the bed, a whispered plea could later be repeated as sedition. Henry's own paranoia demanded it. The bedroom was no sanctuary. It was an interrogation chamber disguised with velvet hangings. And so, the bedchamber rules closed in a circle of dread. To lie beside Henry in his last years was to share a bed with death itself. To survive meant suppressing revulsion, concealing grief, smiling through the gagging stench of wounds. And outside the curtains, the world sharpened its knives, waiting for one misstep to justify execution. Love was impossible in that room. Safety was an illusion. The bed, meant to cradle heirs, became a trapdoor to the tower. These rules were not quirks of one man's vanity. They were the logical extreme of a monarchy that made the private public, that turned a woman's body into national property, and that demanded loyalty even from the heart's most unwilling corners. Henry's bedchamber was the most dangerous room in England. It smelled of rot, rang with whispers, and recorded the downfall of queens whose only crime was being human in a world that demanded miracles. And so the story closes where it began, in a room that should have been sacred, but was instead desecrated by power. A bed that should have sheltered love instead produced terror. Curtains that should have granted privacy instead veiled surveillance. To lie in that bed was to gamble with your life, and more often than not, to lose. This was Henry's true legacy. Not only the splintering of Christendom, not only the palaces and portraits, but the transformation of intimacy into tyranny. The horror of his bedroom was not an accident. It was his reign in miniature, control enforced through fear, loyalty measured through pain, and rumor sharpened into the blade that ended lives. The textbooks say he had 6 wives. The truth is more haunting. 6 women entered a room believing they were brides, and one by one discovered they were prisoners.